Let us admit that something called spirit exists, and exists invisibly in a manner of its own, by virtue of an intrinsic moral intensity. Its essence lies in willing, suffering, looking, being pleased, absorbed, or offended. It talks to itself inaudibly, evoking and releasing an infinity of fugitive images, yet sometimes proceeding to a conclusion in the comparatively fixed possession of an idea, without being a substance separable from the act of feeling or thinking. This spirit lives through time as in a dream. It remains spirit throughout, not only in its specific character of witness and living light, but in its capacity for recollecting and prefiguring its experience. It forms designs and develops them dramatically in idea, yet in effect it is helpless and evanescent. It awakes and dies down at no command of its own. Its center seems to travel, passing from one occasion to another, and, for all we can see, arising out of nothing, not once only, but often and often lapsing into nothing again. Whence this fevered existence? When does it arise? In what places does it exist? With what diversity of dramatic experience and intellectual scope? These are cosmological questions. Whether there are spirits in the mountaintops, or in the clouds, or in the higher parts of the heavens, or wandering ghosts at night, or souls waiting in limbo for reincarnation or for the resurrection of their bodies, spirit can never discover by withdrawing within itself. The more it is spirit, the less interested it will be in those romantic possibilities. Even the terrible alternative between heaven and hell for their own souls and for those of all mankind, an alternative which many spiritual persons have faced intellectually, has left them strangely unperturbed, unless indeed they interpreted that doctrine spiritually as representing the torments or liberation of spirit everywhere and at any time. I think that, on the other hand, theosophists and spiritualists follow a shrewd instinct when, in support of their beliefs, they turn to natural science and to physical phenomena. Matter is the principle of distribution for spirit as for every other feature of the existing world. The other world, if it exists, is a neighbor or extension of this world, so that intercommunication may well be possible between the two. Travelers may pass from one to the other, and the change of scene need not destroy the identity of the characters or the unity of the play. Supersensitive persons might feel strange influences descending on them from those remote regions. Our habitual ignorance cannot abolish what happens to be unknown to us or forbid it to exist. Conjecture is therefore free to imagine as much spirit in the world as it pleases, or as the analogies of nature may impose on our dramatic or brotherly sense. On the other hand, positive belief in imagined spirits, by pressing poetic apprehension into alleged truth, transfers the question to empirical and scientific ground. Such belief has little to do with the subject of this book. which touches rather the internal economy of spirit in whatever world and with whatever companions it may chance to dwell. The landscape of future lives, the private experiences of gods or angels, would place spiritual dilemmas before the spirit no less insistently than human experience places them. And perhaps the same solutions would suggest themselves there also, negative, ascetic, and mystical, in heaven as well as on earth. At least it would probably be so if those spirits were more spiritual than ourselves and less ignorant, rather than merely wilder, happier, and freer. Thus, how wide or how thick may be the population of spirits in nature is frankly irrelevant to actual spiritual life. Seeking or losing in each instance the path to inward salvation. Yet, those cosmological problems cannot help interesting the philosopher who may be investigating from the outside the origin and place of spirit in the universe. I will therefore say a word about them before proceeding to other matters. In the first place, is spirit distributed at all? Might it not be the fundamental locus of all other things? This is what spirit itself is inclined to assert when it becomes thoroughly self conscious and perceives its transcendental relation to every discovery it may make. The pure insight here is invincible, but hard to maintain pure. The flux of existence prevents. At any moment, we may inhale and suck in the whole universe ideally, but exhaling will never restore that universe to its natural reality. Every vista, temporal or spatial, will have been gathered up into the intense present vision in which alone it exists. For discursive thought, however, this concentrated actuality is a blind alley. Emotionally, we are enraptured. We have momentarily become God, a truly solitary and unclouded deity. No scheming, commanding, responsible creator or governor of a universe, but a pure fact, pure possession of all truth, incapable of creating anything. For to create effectually would be to generate something external to oneself, of which this transcendental spirit, by hypothesis, could know nothing. The only possible way for spirit to create is to imagine. Thus, consciousness, in making itself the seat and criterion of reality, denies itself of knowledge. The truth is that knowledge and consciousness are transcendental in regard to ideas, but not in regard to the objects which furnish the occasion and the external control for those ideas. It is merely fatuous to identify our ideas with their objects in theory, but it would be tragic if anyone did so in action. The temptation to do so is real, as we see in dreams, because spirit truly has a vital priority and universality in respect to its eventual knowledge. But this holds only of the single private perspectives, scattered as actual spirit is scattered along the ups and downs of natural life. Scarcely has imagination in some exalted, mystical moments swallowed up all time and change. When that insight lapses, we suffer a jolt. Our heaven is clouded over. There is not only thunder and lightning above us, but our very soul begins to cry for help. It turns out that the spirit that had seemed to compose and deploy. The universe is itself an incident in the universe, subject to fortune and broken into moments and into fragmentary views, even if somewhere, in some superhuman instance, it should be able to embrace all things in idea. It surely exists also elsewhere in other instances in which that omniscience is lost and that peace turned to anguish. When the mind's eye, in which all things were supposed to be painted, peers tearful and half blind into a dreadful past and an unknown future. A philosophy, then, reposing entirely on the transcendental dignity of spirit would not represent the cosmos as animated, since there would be no cosmos, only dreams generated by ignorance and delusion, and it would not even represent spirit legitimately as animating the conventional history of the world as attested by documents, for the past too would be a creation of the present. But transcendentalism is seldom taken so strictly. When the Germans talk of spirit animating history or even nature, they're not thinking of the actual spirit in themselves at that moment, framing that vista. They are rather giving the name of spirit in a metaphorical sense to some tendency or principle or law which they vaguely conceive the facts to obey. Such spirit is not a spiritual reality, but what I call an essence or, at best, a trope. In itself, a conceived rhythm or, if actually executed by events, a truth about them. So when the Indians talk of Brahma as the support and only reality of the universe, they are evoking something to which, in my vocabulary, the name of spirit cannot belong. This Brahma is a state of deep sleep in which spirit, matter, and essence seem to lie concentrated and undeveloped. The dreamer is felt to be deeper than the dream, physiologically quite true, but is this non dreaming dreamer a spirit? I know what the Indians might say about Brahma at once hearing and not hearing, seeing and not seeing, etc. He does hear, in as much as, whenever creatures hear it, it is only he that hears in them. Yet he does not hear, since in his own person he is free from all relativity or privation, seated in no particular station or organ, and not subject to the false intrusion of sensation or thought, things which are false because founded on ignorance of all the rest of infinite being. Brahma can lend no ear to these illusions, but annuls them morally and sleeps on as the deep sea sleeps on, unmindful of the vain transitory lights and vain transitory tempests that play upon the surface. Very well, I have no quarrel with that intuition or with any intuition. Yet, in terms of the logic implicit in common sense, the Brahma, so described, would become actual spirit only when somewhat ruffled by circumstances and actually hearing, etc. Insofar as he remained asleep in a dead calm, he would be only the non existent possibility of spirit, the unused category of thought, the unexemplified essence of any consciousness that might arise eventually. The profound reality of Brahma in his deep sleep is surely felt to be much more than that. He preeminently exists. He is precisely what is substantial and solid, warm and vital in all things, the positive potentiality of all universes and of all thoughts. Undoubtedly, but then my name for Brahma would not be spirit, but matter, because in my system, as the name for the intrinsic ideal possibility of all things is essence. So the name for existing potentiality of specific things is matter. This identification may seem extravagant. The highly subtle notion of Brahma, or transcendental spirit breathing at peace, lies at the opposite pole from stocks and stones, fire and blood. Yet the Indians themselves often identify Brahma with ether, with breath, or even, like Thales, with water. It is they, not I, that confuse spirit with the primary substance of things. It has always been under the spell of natural forces that poets have shaped their mythology, and it is still by an intense concentration on mere life, mere duration, or mere dumb existence that the mystic experiences his identity with the Absolute. This identity is hidden, latent, destructive of detail. It is an identity of substance in a diversity of persons. But the substance of spirit is matter, as all other transitory things. Were the notion of spirit not thus fused with that of substance, as it notoriously was by Parmenides, it could never carry that suggestion of indestructible primacy, power, and intimate secret presence in all things which it evidently carries to the devout mind. The devout mind is pious and anxious as well as spiritual. It never, therefore, quite divorces the idea of salvation from that of safety and profit. Now, safety, a treacherous safety, and profit, a temporary profit, are in the gift of matter, of fortune, and few would worship spirit if they did not understand it to be the very breath and law of material things. But this breath bloweth where it listeth, and this law ironical in that it destroys everything that it fosters. Thus, experience of the world turns a clear spirit away from the world, and substance, when recognized in its indefinite and vain fertility, invites the spirit to withdraw within itself. There is thus a kind of cooperation and understanding between pure matter and pure spirit. As matter is plastic and blindly prolific, so spirit, in its inviolate transcendental station, is infinitely open and detached from particulars. It offers, as it were, an intangible mirror to matter, like a glass sky traversed by no heavenly bodies. Thus, the moral safety of spirit, the joy of its inner intellectual liberty, seems to the natural man a sublimated echo of material safety and good fortune. The prophets express salvation in the language of prosperity, as the mystics in that of love. They are not content that heaven and hell should be merely within us, or that insight should be its own reward. Though the chastened spirit may secretly smile, it will be reputed by the pious to work miracles. Philosophical demagogues will promise to turn the most vulgar of generations into gods, and even in the Upanishads, the enthusiastic king, quite convinced at the end of each lesson that all things are indifferent, cries to the Brahmin, I will give thee, O venerable one, 1,000 cows. I think then that in fundamental sympathy with Indian wisdom, we may draw the following distinctions in our own language. In so far as Brahma is conceived as a universal readiness for thinking, undetermined to any particular thought, he is the essence of pure transcendental spirit, and non-existent until exemplified in some actual intuition. insofar as he is conceived to be infinitely pregnant and to contain virtually the characters of all possible beings, but without any distinction of subject from object or any actual intuition. Brahma is pure being or the realm of essence. Insofar as this potentiality is conceived to be something real and extant, since avowedly phenomena are not created by pure spirit but produced naturally by a regular development of works and psychic heredities. Brahma is the inner reality of matter. Insofar as within particular psyches, Brahma hears, sees, thinks, and suffers, he is existent spirit. He exists only diffused, but it is only by attaining his transcendental dignity and cognitive essence that particular psyches can ever hear, see, think, or suffer actually and in a moral sense, so that it is the one pure quality of spirit, it is Brahma himself that blows through all living beings whenever they are stirred to consciousness. This Indian notion of deity corresponds best to our modern insight into the transcendental nature of spirit. For here, subjectivism in logic and sentiment is united with naturalism in the description of the world. But our own religious traditions do better justice to the moral and tragic side of the matter. Spirit does not lose its divine nature by becoming incarnate in man, by being rejected by the world, and by suffering and dying. On the contrary, apart from such incarnation, God would remain only a natural power or an infinite essence or a vain ideal. If spirit first renders man divine, humanity first renders God moral. We might even read this meaning into the Philoke clause of the Creed, saying that a Holy Spirit could never have proceeded from the Father if it had not also proceeded from the Son. Neither transcendental nor Indian idealism can therefore avail to animate the cosmos. They may profess to reduce it to an illusion or to an unconscious work of the spirit, but spirit itself will thereby forfeit its spiritual nature until, becoming conscious in the vicissitudes of that too real world, it asserts its spirituality by surmounting them. In its reality, then, spirit will be dispersed and very thinly in the world which it is alleged to create. Might not this dispersion of spirit be admitted and yet the exclusive reality of it be maintained? Might it not exist in an infinite number of instances with only spiritual relations between them? I can conceive such a universe, although I know of no philosopher that has described it. Leibniz, perhaps, came near it in his ingenious monadology, but his monads were souls developing through physical time. If he had taken the transcendental unity of spirit seriously, he would have been compelled to break up his personal monads into as many spiritual monads as there were instants of life in each of them, and the relations between these instants, like those between different souls, would have become moral only, subsisting in the realm of truth, without any physical medium of distribution, not even a physical time. Perhaps such was his secret insight, if he ever applied the principle of internal relations to the moments of time. For then the temporal vistas within each moment would correspond with the temporal vistas of all other moments, yet the moments would not occupy distinct dates in any physical time flowing beneath them or through them. Distribution into separate souls, each with a consecutive life, is by no means essential to spirit. In our world, spirit is so distributed because a certain persistence on the part of an organism must, according to the established order of nature, precede any sensation. And it is from our animal souls and lives that spirit borrows that moral and dramatic character which marks its most vivid moments in ourselves. Indeed, without expectation, memory, and impulsive preference, we should hardly give to intuition the name of spirit. On the other hand, in order to exist at one moment, spirit does not require to have existed before or to exist later. And if Leibniz identified spirit with long lived souls and souls again with indestructible atoms, this was due to theological and conceptual commitments that need not detain us. Such a hypothesis is not one to accept or to disprove. It is a fable. Yet the remarkable many-sided competence of Leibniz is in composing it, distinguished at several crucial points what is congruous with the essence of spirit from what is incongruous. Here is a lesson to learn, and in spite of our modern progressive frivolity, never to unlearn again. It is congruous with spirit to be existentially insulated and solipsistic, yet in its own solitude, to keep an intellectual outlook over its own career, past and future, and over a world felt to surround and control it. For while spirit is enormously active, morally and imaginatively, a great dreamer and full of obsessing cares, yet it is subject at every turn to external vitalities, to surprises and torments, and even when left relatively free, it often feels within itself a sudden tendency to fall asleep, or a sudden tendency to stretch its normal wakefulness to abnormal lengths, as if it could grow omniscient, divinely balanced, and superior to every accident. All this Leibniz admirably indicates in his myth of the everlasting monads, infinite in number, cut off essentially from one another, but each developing or perhaps reverting through all the stages of slumber, dream, and intelligence. At the same time, it is incongruous with spirit to appear or to operate in the physical world. It can never descend from its transcendental station of witness and judge into the region of objects. It lives, indeed, in a natural society, but that fact can never abolish its spiritual solitude, nor the intrinsic centrality of thought in each of its instances. And the counterpart of this spiritual concentration is the infinity of possible instances of thought. Thus, the monadology exhibits in a myth the inwardness and transcendental purity of spirit, its spark-like unity and star-like multiplicity, and all later transcendental idealism only elaborates the notion of this solitary thinking monad of Leibniz, thinking its fated world. Nevertheless, this allegiance to pure notion of spirit involved Leibniz in hopeless difficulties when turning his radical transcendentalism into a cosmology. He identified his monad first with the psyche, and then, even more extravagantly, with the physical atom, so that the light of consciousness, something essentially warm, moral, volatile, something spiritual, became the substance of the cosmos, comminuted, geometricized, galvanized, and persisting ad infinitum. In this sphere, the notion of a monad without windows repeats the conceptual atomism of Democritus, who wished matter to be composed of indestructible geometrical solids. But ideal fixity of any kind is false to the intimately fluid and relational nature of existence. The natural atom is all windows, at least dynamically, and even in the scheme of Democritus, it was the motions, shocks, and congeries of the atoms that supplied the needed orchestration for the life of nature. Indeed, the metaphor of being windowless was not altogether happy even for spirit, for although spirit can emit nothing passively from outside, nothing of foreign manufacture, yet its inward inventiveness is fed by external stimuli and made cognitive by anxiety about ulterior things. The unity here is that of outlook, and the counterpart of it is a universal curiosity, an impartial aptness to know and to experience everything whatsoever. If spirit be without windows, or rather without doors, it lives by peering perpetually outwards through that dome of many-colored but transparent glass which the psyche has built round it. The light, however, and this is the main point, is not that of a sun outside, but of a fire within. It is animal life kindled into flame and dramatizing the world from that focus with the spasmodic chiaroscuro of good and evil. The monadology of Leibniz appeared at an unfortunate moment, and hardly received the developments it demanded. For scarcely had the universe been analyzed in Germany into nothing but souls, when the soul was analyzed in England into nothing but perceptions. And it was a just nemesis, because the soul, if anything, is a poetic name for a biological reality. For the psyche, a system of tropes in animal life, as observable facts are the naturata of natural history, and the psyche is the same facts synthesized logically into an ideal naturans. It had therefore been a false step, a step into empty air, to ignore the hereditary formative psyche and to give the name of soul to consciousness. However attenuated or dull this consciousness might be said to be, degrees of vivacity in feeling are perhaps only relative and imputed. Where feeling arises at all, it brings its own standard of intensity. Leibniz had passed in his monadology, founded on the logic of parts and wholes, into a fictitious region. His psychology had become literary, where perception, introspection, memory, and reasoning exhaust the realities conceived or conceivable. In this literary psychology, there is no psyche. There are only images, emotions, dramatic fictions, verbal associations. It was therefore a sort of ironical duty for any shrewd reader of Leibniz to abandon his system, since his critical principle, reducing nature to spiritual monads, reduced his monads at once to passing intuitions. And then we should have only these atomic and homeless intuitions on our hands with which to compose a universe. Our universe would have no souls in it, and no substances or causes, only a cloud of psychological states existing in no medium and produced by no agency. Cosmos is not the word to describe such a world, yet the chaos it dissolves into, if consistently thought out, has one great merit for my present purpose. It is composed exclusively of spirit, and undiluted actuality permeates every part. By examining this system, we may see how far spirit alone might go to constitute a world, and by what illusions we might disguise the essential incapacity of spirit to generate itself or to collect its instances into an historical process. In the first place, there are unavoidable but illegitimate implications in the chief terms that a psychological idealism is compelled to use. The words idealism and idea are themselves illegitimate and constantly ambiguous. An idea is properly an essence, and idealism a system that attributes power to the essences exemplified in things, as if their beauty or clearness had caused matter to assume those forms. But this contradicts the nominalism and the skepticism inherent in any genuine retreat into the passing state of mind. Nor are the names commonly given to these states of mind less misleading. They are not properly perceptions, for a perception implies an object or occasion provoking and justifying that perception, whereas in pure psychologism there is never any object save the contents of the mind at the moment, and there is no present occasion deeper than that state of mind to determine what that state of mind shall be. Sensation and feeling, in the same way, suggest more than what psychologism can allow. They suggest a plight of the organism, a movement in things, of which the spirit becomes morally aware without yet discerning any graphic image. Finally, idea remains to render confusion worse confounded. For while still often meaning essence, it also means intuition, some episode in the life of spirit, or even the whole passing state of the psyche, in which much more may lie fermenting than the discrimination of any recognizable idea. All this confusion is involuntary and excusable in a philosophy struggling against common sense and the genius of human language. Sometimes an effort is made to clear the air and adopt fresh and more appropriate categories, and we hear less of states of mind and more of phenomena, data, or even objects. But this path leads away from psychologism and back to essences and things, as by another less honorable path through unconscious mind and psychic powers supposed to be spiritual. We return likewise to Mother Nature. Much deeper runs the delusion of having superseded the physical world by a purely spiritual society. A purely spiritual society is conceivable, but not as modern philosophy may conceive. Such a society would be a community of angels, each singing his note in eternity, notes which might compose a harmony of which each might be somehow aware. But between these intuitive sorrows or joys, there would be no temporal sequence, no communication or causation. Every phrase of that music, though there might be musical perspectives and infinite undertones within it, would in its existence be without date or place, and these phrases could neither physically collect nor physically separate themselves into parallel series, such as common sense conceives human lives to be. A purely spiritual world would be a monadology of conscious moments, an ideal symphony of emotions conspiring or contrasting, but never meeting or merging or generating one another. If the romantic society of active, colliding, and well known spirits conceived, for instance, by Berkeley, differs so radically from that celestial swarm of spiritual atoms, the reason is that naturalism survives illegitimately in the habitual idealist, as of all men. The stuff of modern idealism is not ideas, it is not spirits, but novelesque literary psychology. And this psychology, being biographical, moves in the frame of physical time and physical evolution. It describes the supposed inner experience of human souls born at one date and buried at another in particular geographical places, souls traveling with their bodies like the soul of Locke in his coach between Oxford and London. The psychological philosopher may reduce his idea of the physical world to a fiction of the imagination, symbolizing his spiritual relations with his own past and future, and with other spirits. But this reduction he makes dialectically in argument and on paper. He is absolutely debarred from making it in his real belief or daily conceptions, not only because contrary assumptions are involved and ratified in action, but because if he did not make these contrary assumptions, his own social idealism would be blown to the winds. Men are animals, and human society is an animal society. Spirit is undoubtedly incarnate in those men, and may on occasion withdraw into itself mystically and disengage itself ascetically from the animal interest of life. But you cannot have it both ways. If you are wedded to the flesh and to the world, very well, your spirit may enjoy following their fortunes, but then you cannot liberate yourself, save in empty words, from acknowledging their existence and their dominion. It is not by calling them fictions and still serving them that you will pass into a spiritual sphere. Your affections, your self love, your conceit of freedom and immortality would need first to be disinfected and renounced. They are all animal passions, forms of animal lust, pride, and propulsiveness. Then, if what remained or supervened seemed to you bliss, you might say truly that you were a spirit alone with the spirit, and it would not concern you any longer to deny matter as if you were afraid of it or of the notion of it, for now you would no longer be living competitively within nature against the rest of nature, but speculatively and disinterestedly in sight of the whole, and you would be essentially too much above nature to chafe at being existentially a very small part of it. Cosmic animism has therefore no real affinity with spiritual insight or spiritual liberation. Spiritual minds may legitimately give names to all things according to the part these things play in the spiritual drama. But this is poetry to be understood poetically. Any dogmatic assertion of the spiritual texture of things in turning spirit into power turns it unwittingly into matter, and the consequences are not confined to a change of vocabulary. The very notion of spirit is thereby lost or infected, and the man in whom spirit seemed to awake becomes again a busybody and a worldling, a partisan and a fanatic, a slave of time, a dupe of place, and a puppet in an evolution which he calls spiritual, but which is really that of the material world.